The classroom was silent for a moment. Then the teacher laughed. A sharp, mocking laugh that made Jamal's skin crawl. "Your mom is a journalist? That explains a lot," she smirked, shaking her head. The class erupted in giggles, some students exchanging amused glances. Jamal's fingers curled into fists under his desk. He took a slow breath, his heart pounding. His mother had always told him to pick his battles wisely. But this was not one he could walk away from. "Do you have something to say, Jamal?" Mrs. Carter teased, her smile widening. He looked up, his voice steady. "Yeah, I do." What he said next left the entire class in shocked silence, and made the teacher's face turn pale. "Before we continue, let us know. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below." Jamal kept his eyes on his teacher, his pulse steady. He had seen this look before. The smirk, the way her eyes glowed when she thought she was being clever. Mrs. Carter always had a way of putting certain students in their place, making them the joke, making them small. And today, the joke was on him. The class sat in a mix of amusement and unease. Some students chuckled, happy to watch the show. Others looked away, sensing that the air had shifted. Jamal's best friend, Caleb, tapped his pencil against his desk, silently urging him to let it go. But Jamal couldn't. Mrs. Carter was one of those teachers who thought she was tough but fair, the kind who said she treated everyone the same. Yet somehow, students like Jamal always ended up on the receiving end of her sarcasm. He wasn't surprised, though. He had seen it before. His grades questioned, his tone corrected, his answers doubted. And now she had turned her attention to his mom. Jamal's mother, Angela Reed, wasn't just a journalist. She was a force. She had spent years uncovering corruption, exposing stories people tried to bury. People feared her words. But to Mrs. Carter, she was just another woman with opinions. Opinions that could be mocked. Jamal straightened in his chair. If Mrs. Carter thought he was going to let this slide, she was wrong. What he was about to say would change everything. Jamal leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "You think it's funny?" His words cut through the lingering laughter, making a few students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Carter crossed her arms, still smirking. "Relax, Jamal. It's just a joke." "A joke?" He let the words settle. "Mocking my mom's job is a joke?" Mrs. Carter shrugged. "Come on, don't be so sensitive. You know how the media is, always twisting things, always looking for trouble. I mean, that's what journalists do, right? Stir the pot?" A few students chuckled, but the energy in the room had changed. Caleb glanced at Jamal, silently warning him to let it go. But Jamal wasn't letting anything go. "You don't even know what my mom does," he said. "You don't know the kind of work she does, the risks she takes. But you think it's okay to sit here and laugh?" Mrs. Carter exhaled loudly, shaking her head. "Jamal, it's not that deep." Jamal nodded slowly. "Right, not that deep." He reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone. "Let's see if you think this is funny." He tapped on the screen a few times, then turned the phone so the entire class could see. A news article popped up. The headline read, "Uncovering the Truth: How One Journalist Exposed a System of Bias in Schools." Mrs. Carter's smirk faltered. Jamal cleared his throat. "This was written by my mom. A few months ago, she investigated how teachers grade students unfairly based on race. Turns out, a lot of black and brown students get lower grades even when their work is just as good." The class fell silent. A few students glanced at each other, their expressions shifting. Jamal kept going. You know what else she found? Teachers using sarcasm, belittling students, making sure certain kids never felt smart enough to speak up. Mrs. Carter's arms slowly unfolded. Jamal, he wasn't done. Some teachers even got fired because of this article. Schools changed their policies. Parents started asking more questions. He tilted his head. Still funny? A few students let out quiet ohs, sensing the shift in power. Caleb nudged Jamal's elbow, eyes wide. Mrs. Carter swallowed, straightening her posture. That's not what we're talking about. I was making a general point. Jamal raised an eyebrow. A general point about my mom? About journalists? He shook his head. No, you thought you could make fun of her because you didn't think anyone would push back. You thought it was okay to laugh at her because you assumed I wouldn't say anything. Mrs. Carter's lips parted, but no words came out. The class was silent. Some students looked shocked, others impressed. A few pulled out their phones, subtly recording. Jamal wasn't smiling. His voice didn't waver. You talk about journalism like it's a joke, but my mom's work actually matters. She uncovers the truth. She exposes people who think they can get away with things just because no one calls them out. He let that sink in. And today, that person is you. A few students gasped. Someone whispered, "Damn!" Mrs. Carter's face turned red. "That's enough, Jamal." Jamal leaned back in his chair, his point made. "Yeah, that's what people always say when they don't want to hear the truth." Mrs. Carter looked toward the door like she was hoping someone would save her, but no one was coming. And the worst part? She knew she had lost control. Mrs. Carter's face was tense, her lips pressed together in a tight line. The entire class was watching. The energy in the room had shifted, and for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. Jamal sat back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't being disrespectful. He was simply stating facts. And that was what made it worse for Mrs. Carter. She cleared her throat. "Jamal, I think you're overreacting." Jamal tilted his head. "Overreacting?" His voice was calm, measured. "You mocked my mother's career in front of the whole class. You laughed at what she does. And now, when I defend her, I'm the one overreacting?" The room was silent. Even the students who normally tuned out were paying attention now. Mrs. Carter sighed, shaking her head. "I didn't mean it like that. I was just making a joke." Jamal nodded slowly. "Right. And I'm sure all the teachers my mom exposed in her investigation felt the same way. Just jokes, right? Nothing serious, nothing harmful." A few students murmured in agreement. Some glanced at Mrs. Carter, waiting to see how she would respond. She forced a smile, but it was shaky. "Look, let's not turn this into something bigger than it is." Jamal's expression remained unreadable. "You mean, let's not talk about it, because it makes you uncomfortable?" The shift in the room was undeniable now. Mrs. Carter was trying to regain her footing, but it was slipping away fast. She let out a forced chuckle. "Jamal, you're taking this way too personally." Jamal let out a short breath. "It is personal." More whispers rippled through the class. Someone muttered, "He's got a point." Mrs. Carter's face turned red. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Jamal didn't let up. "You don't respect my mom's work, and you don't respect me. And I wonder if you would have made that joke if I wasn't who I am." The air in the room shifted. The weight of his words hit hard. Mrs. Carter's face paled slightly. "Jamal, I treat all my students the same." Jamal let out a humorless laugh. "Really? Because I've seen the way you talk to people like Caleb versus the way you talk to me. I've seen the way you question my answers more than others. I've seen the way you assume I didn't put in the effort. But when someone else gets the same grade, it's just a bad test day for them." The class was silent. No one dared to speak. Mrs. Carter's breathing was uneven now. She looked around, realizing she wasn't just talking to Jamal anymore. She was talking to all of them. That's not true," she stammered. Jamal shrugged. "Maybe not to you, but that's the thing about bias. You don't always notice it." The classroom was dead silent. The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. Mrs. Carter swallowed hard. "Look, I'm not going to argue with you in front of the class." Jamal nodded. "Right. Because now that the joke's over, it's not so funny anymore, is it?" A student in the back whispered, "Damn." Mrs. Carter's face was bright red. The class had never seen her like this. She was always the one in charge, the one who held the power. But now, that power was gone. Jamal looked around at his classmates. "See, this is why my mom does what she does. Because people like Mrs. Carter don't think they're doing anything wrong. They don't think their jokes, their tone, their assumptions matter. But they do. And if no one ever calls it out, nothing changes." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy cloud. For the first time, Mrs. Carter looked unsure. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Jamal didn't need to say anything else, because at that moment everyone knew. The truth had already won. The classroom was still. No one dared to move. The weight of Jamal's words had settled over everything, and for once Mrs. Carter didn't have a response. She looked down at her desk, shifting papers around as if pretending this wasn't happening, but it was happening. Jamal could see it in his classmates' faces, the way some of them were nodding, the way others looked deep in thought, as if they were only now realizing something they had ignored for too long. Even the students who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable, unsure of where they stood. Then the door creaked open. The principal, Miss Daniels, stepped inside. She held a clipboard in one hand, her sharp eyes scanning the classroom. "Everything all right here?" No one spoke. Jamal didn't look away. He knew his words had power, but he also knew moments like this didn't just disappear. If no one followed up, nothing would change. Miss Daniels raised an eyebrow, glancing at Mrs. Carter. "I was walking past and overheard a conversation." Mrs. Carter straightened in her seat. "It was just a misunderstanding." Jamal let out a breath. "No, it wasn't." His voice was steady. "She laughed at my mom's job, mocked journalism, and tried to make me feel small for defending her." Miss Daniels turned back to the class. "Is this true?" For a second, there was silence. Then, one voice. "Yeah." Another nod. "It is." More murmurs followed. Students who usually never spoke up were now confirming everything. Mrs. Carter looked around, her face pale. That's not what happened. I was just making a joke." Miss Daniels nodded slowly. "That's interesting, because I've received complaints about your comments before." The room tensed. Jamal felt his heartbeat quicken. "Complaints?" Mrs. Carter looked stunned. "Complaints?" Miss Daniels sighed. "Students have come to me before about your behavior, the way you talk to them, the way you treat certain students differently." Jamal wasn't the first. He was just the first to say something in front of everyone. A few students exchanged glances. Caleb gave Jamal a small nod as if to say, "You were right to speak up." Mrs. Carter's voice was quiet now. I didn't realize." Miss Daniels didn't let her finish. "I think we need to have a conversation. In my office, now." The class was completely still. Jamal didn't feel like celebrating. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about Mrs. Carter getting in trouble. It was about the fact that, finally, someone listened. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like something was actually going to change. The class was still silent long after Mrs. Carter left the room with Miss Daniels. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy in the air, something no one knew how to process. Jamal sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His hands were still clenched into fists, but now they felt lighter. He wasn't sure if it was relief, exhaustion, or something in between. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like his voice had actually mattered. Caleb leaned over. "Man," he let out a low whistle. "I didn't think you were actually going to do that." Jamal shrugged. "Yeah, me neither." A few students were still glancing at him, but this time their expressions weren't filled with the same awkward amusement as before. They weren't looking at him like he was just another kid trying to cause trouble. They were looking at him like someone who had said what they were too afraid to say. A girl from the back, Vanessa, crossed her arms. "You know, I always thought she treated us different. I just never had proof." Another student, Malik, shook his head. "Proof or not, you could feel it." He looked at Jamal. She really thought she could say whatever she wanted, and no one would check her. Jamal nodded, but he wasn't smiling. "Yeah, that's how people like her get away with it for so long." The truth was, this wasn't just about Mrs. Carter. It was about the system she was a part of, the unspoken rules, the quiet ways people were treated differently without anyone saying it out loud. Jamal had felt it for years. But today, he didn't let it slide. And maybe that was enough to make at least one person think twice next time. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As students grabbed their bags, some stopped by Jamal's desk. "You did the right thing, man." That was brave. Respect. Jamal simply nodded. He didn't need applause. He didn't need people to hype him up. He just needed them to remember, to pay attention next time, to speak up when something felt wrong. He grabbed his backpack and headed toward the door. As he stepped out into the hallway, his phone buzzed. A message from his mom. "Mom, hey, I heard what happened today. I'm proud of you. Let's talk when you get home." Jamal exhaled slowly, a small smile forming. His mom had always told him that words had power. Today, he'd finally understood exactly what she meant. Jamal walked home that day feeling different. Not lighter, not heavier, just different. He had spoken up, and for once, someone had actually listened. But this wasn't just about him. This was about every kid who ever sat in a classroom feeling unheard. Every student who had been talked down to, judged, or ignored because someone assumed they wouldn't push back. His mom always told him that silence was a choice, that when people don't speak up, nothing ever changes. Today, he had made his choice. And maybe, just maybe, it would make a difference. Mrs. Carter would face consequences, but that wasn't the victory. The real win was that his classmates had seen what standing up looked like. They had felt the power of truth. And maybe next time, when something didn't feel right, they wouldn't just sit there. Maybe they would be the ones to say something. Because one voice, that's all it takes to make people stop and think. Have you ever spoken up when you knew something was wrong? Share your story in the comments below. Let's talk about it. Let's listen. Let's learn. And if you want to see more stories that make you think, feel, and question, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because conversations like this, they matter.